Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Sherry Turkle, who is the Abbey Rockefeller Mosé Professor of Social Studies of Science and Technology in the Program in Science, Technology, and Society at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's a prolific writer and has published many books, including Life on the Screen, Identity in the Age of the Internet, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, and most recently, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. Sherry, welcome to Berkeley.
My pleasure.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and that's where I was raised.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shape your thinking about the world?
I think they had a pretty insular view of the world. I think that they didn't really live much past Brooklyn. And I think that they shaped my view of the world because I so desperately wanted to get out. So I think that they shaped me by encouraging me to follow that dream.
And your interest in psychology and identity, did that come as an undergraduate later, or was it something that developed when you were still at home?
I think that's so interesting. I think I was always very introspective, trying to understand my family culture. I'm writing a memoir now about growing up in Brooklyn, about my family. So I think I was very interested in my family culture and the people around me. So probably I've always been very introspective, and but I think certainly as an undergraduate I studied with Erik Erikson, who was about identity. I remember Erik Erikson, thinking he looked like God. He had this sort of white hair.
And he was very influential in that time, because you're at Harvard in the 60s,
yes.
or Radcliffe, and then
Yes.
Harvard in the 60s.
Yes, and he used to walk the campus with his wife, and I mean, people used to say, look, Mr. and Mrs. God. I mean, he really had that aura. And he taught a course on identity and the life cycle, and I sat in on that course for 3 years, just listening to him talk about identity and the life cycle.
And we'll talk about some of your books in a minute, but yeah. They're written with great clarity, yes. and writing skill. When did this concern, focus, and craft writing come to you? Over time? Did you develop that in high school and in college, or?
I was the editor of but probably I should have answered your question about identity by talking about being editor of my high school newspaper. Mm-hmm. I think I saw myself as a writer in high school before I saw myself as an academic or knew anything about being an academic. I think that I was confirmed in an idea that I would be a writer in high school, because it was the thing I loved. I mean, I didn't know that women could be academics. Even in college, there were really no tenured professors at Harvard. I went to Radcliffe, which you studied with the Harvard faculty. There were no tenured women on the Harvard faculty. I never had a woman as a professor the whole time I was there. Wow. I'm not sure I knew that was a day job for girls. But I knew that there were women writers, and I think I saw myself as a writer before I thought of myself as an academic. So the idea that I would work on my writing and craft my writing and rewrite is certainly something that I, from the very beginning, was of interest to me. And I really do, when my students say to me, well, oh, you're such a good writer, I always say to them, well, you're reading the 30th draft. So writing is editing, and I try to teach that to my students, that that's the trick.
So was it an easy journey from Brooklyn to Radcliffe?
No. No, I went to a high school where my guide, it was no one from my high school went to Ivy League schools. It was very unusual. I was told that to do that, you had to be the valedictorian, and so that was very hard to be the valedictorian. I think there were 1,500 people in the graduating class, so it was a job. And I was valedictorian, and I was very fortunate. And
in high school.
High school,
Yeah.
I got to go.
Yeah.
But it was actually quite. It was really a job to be to get that accomplished. But I was, if I hadn't, I'm sure I would have gotten to a good school if I'd been number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But it was actually a task.
But besides Erickson, who were your mentors or your great influencers in your undergraduate education?
Barrington Moore, who was a great Marxist, Stanley Hoffman, who ignited my study of France and French intellectual life, I wrote my first book on France, and that was very influenced by studying with Stanley Hoffman. Lawrence Wiley, another scholar of French life. George Homans, a sociologist at Harvard, who was very important to me. Marty Peretz, who was the chairman of the Social Studies Department, which was my undergraduate major. I had many mentors. I was very fortunate. I really had many. David Reisman, a student of American culture. There was a lot of, I was very fortunate in that I was at Harvard at a time when there was a lot of political ferment, but also a lot of attention paid to undergraduate teaching and to undergraduate majors. And I had a great undergraduate experience. I really did. I was very, very fortunate.
Was it the times that made you so voracious a student, or was this something that came from your background?
Well, I went there ready to, I went there ready to
absorb.
I was like, I'm here,
Yeah.
So, I want to give myself full credit that I kind of got there ready to go. But I think it was also the times. I think that it was very political time, so I wanted to, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Freud. Everything was relevant to thinking about politics, to thinking about, how did people absorb ideas? What ideas were important? What ideas could help you think through American culture? The world, I was lit to understand what was happening, and I didn't understand anything. And people felt that great ideas. I think this is perhaps a difference from now, is that people around me felt that history would help me understand what was happening.
And that ideas mattered.
And that ideas mattered. And I'm not sure that now, when people try to understand our current dilemma, people want to go to Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Freud. I think that I was in a group of people where that was the first thing that occurred to us, was to try to understand our dilemma by going to history, by going to sociology, to great ideas.
You then went to France. Now, was this before you graduated?
Yes. It was an interesting convergence of things. I had a personal difficulty. My mom died when I was in college. My mother died, and I was in no state. I couldn't study, I couldn't work. I needed to take a break. And I had been studying French politics and society, and I went to France. I dropped out of school. I worked as a cleaning lady in France. And I went to Sciences Po. So I was a kind of cleaning lady student. While there, I was there just after the May Days, and I observed something that would turn out to be quite fateful for my later work. I observed that people who had been active in the May Days were starting to kind of converged towards getting interested in psychoanalysis, but not any psychoanalysis, the psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan, which was kind of unusual because in America, the people who were interested in politics did not kind of trend towards the psychoanalysis. On the contrary, people who were interested in politics thought that psychoanalytic things was kind of moving away from politics towards an interest in the self. Those two trends were very different because I was interested in Freud, and that was a very different track than being interested in politics.
And what was different about it?
Well, that was the question for me. What was there about Jacques Lacan, his brand of psychoanalysis, that people felt that moving from politics to psychoanalysis was kind of doing the same thing? And that question of what was this politically acceptable psychoanalysis became the theme of my first book, because then when I came back to Harvard to do a PhD in sociology and psychology, the subject of my dissertation was psychoanalytic politics, became my first book, which was really what was the mystery, this intellectual history mystery of what was there about the Lacanian movement that had made this slippage from politics to psychoanalysis possible? What was this infatuation with Freud that had made this a kind of political psychoanalysis?
And did that slippage make politics interesting? And did it offer explanatory power for these mass movements?
Well, it wasn't. It offered a political language for psychoanalysis. The Communist Party became interested in Lacan. It offered a political language to psychoanalysis, and it offered a way to make to think about politics in a psychological way, and you know, I think I think people sensed that it wasn't the moment for a political revolution in France, and they wanted to continue to think about, they wanted a way to think about the self in a way that was politicized. And the Lacanian movement provided that. And it was a very interesting time, and I interviewed psychoanalysts, I interviewed political people, but what really was very fascinating for me, and that then provided a transition to my later work, is I became interested in the idea of not the psychoanalytic movement, but the psychoanalytic culture. That is to say, what happens to psychoanalytic ideas when they sort of hit the street, and they're no longer the ideas of the intelligentsia, but they're the ideas that people use really in everyday life. You know, what happens to ideas not as they're elaborated by intellectuals, but as they're brought into people's sort of everyday lives. And that became important to me because when I began to study artificial intelligence, I wasn't interested in these ideas as they were developed in seminar rooms, but as they came down and hit the street, when people began to use ideas from computers to talk about their own minds and their children's minds, you know, kind of as ideas from computation became embedded in everyday life, when people had personal computers. And so that notion of a sociology of sciences of mind as we pick it up in everyday life really became my academic identity. And so there was a kind of, even though the topics changed from psychoanalysis to computer culture, that sort of became my thing.
You are a sociologist,
Yes.
a psychologist,
Yes.
that winds up focusing on the cyber world,
Yes.
and what it's doing to us. I like to ask my guests about the skill sets and the temperament that is at the heart of their work, with the possibility of, advising students about how they prepare for their own future.
Well, What I would say is that when I started out, I looked like I was very confused because I needed to learn how to be a sociologist, because I needed to learn about Durkheim and Weber and Marx and how to think about large social movements. But I needed really, I felt, to learn how to be a clinician, how to learn how to do clinical interviews. I'm trained as a psychoanalyst as well. I felt I needed a clinical degree. So I looked like somebody who was a little bit all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I felt very conflicted about that because, other people were either going to law school or they were going to getting a degree in political science, or I was jealous of them because they looked so, I don't know, so organized. And I went to Chicago to the Committee on Social Thought, and then I went to Harvard and got a sociology degree, and then I said, no, I also need a clinical degree. I got a joint degree in personality psychology and sociology, and then I got clinical accreditation, and I did a lot of degree. I did a lot of things. So I think that my advice would be I just needed these different skill sets, and I just got these different skill sets. And I just did to get them one after another. And I just would say to students who feel that they need a couple of skill sets, relax. You're going to feel a little disorganized. You may feel a little greedy or a little disorganized, and you'll be jealous of people who seem more organized. But if you feel that your intellectual identity depends on getting these different skill sets, if you can afford it, I had to work jobs and took me a little longer, but just put one foot in front of the other. And so I sort of am glad you asked me this question, because I think that actually I did feel, I don't want to say I felt guilty, but I felt bad about myself, because I felt envious of other people who seemed more organized.
And I want to just ask you, did you know where you were going with all of this, or was it just that you were excited about what you could learn?
I knew that I had this idea of this intimate ethnography. That's how I thought about it. That it seemed to me that I wanted to do a kind of ethnographic work where you interviewed people and you were on the ground in a kind of ethnographic setting. But it seemed to me that the kind of interviewing I wanted to do, to ask somebody, for example, about why they were in psychoanalysis when they had just been in political action, that the kind of an interview that required was actually quite intimate. It was the questions were not like, with your microphones, or, it was a very intimate interview, because it was, asking why they were in psychoanalysis, it took a long time. You couldn't ask it directly. You had to befriend them. They had to trust you. They were maybe going to tell you very intimate things, and they would be talking about the failure of this political movement and how they felt about that, but now they were in psychoanalysis, and they weren't going to say they were in psychoanalysis because the political movement failed. It was going to be you needed skills. And I saw that I didn't have those skills. So to get better at that kind of thing, I needed to really develop skills. And the more clinical skills I had, the better I got at it. So I felt that I needed to really work on clinical skills. And I developed this notion in my mind of intimate ethnography with clinical skills. And so I would say that was my guiding idea. And once I had that guiding idea, well, things fell into place.
When you look at your works, they're two things stand out for me. Not the only two things, but way to approach your work. And one is what you chose to study. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the other is your philosophical perspective. And that seems to be focused on what makes us human, our humanness. Talk a little about that. Does that emerge out of this extraordinary education? Does it inform our understanding of what it is you're doing?
I think that my concern about the human really has come out of my study of computer culture, working with people who are so often saying that we don't need to be human. I mean, I remember I'm just writing a memoir now, and in my work I have already cited the story of Marvin Minsky, and going with Marvin Minsky to a showing of the movie Tron. Marvin Minsky is a great AI, artificial intelligence hero.
Is this the same Minsky who was an economist?
No, he's an artificial intelligence guru.
Okay.
He's one of the founders of artificial intelligence.
Okay.
And we see the movie Tron, which is a movie about the brain and how the brain is made up of a society of programs, and it's a very AI movie. And we come out of the movie, and of course Minsky's very excited, and we're there with all of his students, and we're all talking about his movie as kind of an embodiment of his idea. His idea is called the Society of Mind, and the mind is made up of embodied programs. And Marvin and I get into a conversation, and he says, no children should see, all children should see this movie because it teaches how the mind is made up of programs. No children, children should see this movie, and they shouldn't see the movie Bambi. and I say, well, I love them. I love Bambi. Why shouldn't they see Bambi? Because Bambi teaches that you attach to a mother, and in the future we're all going to be embodied in computers, and there should be no attachment. We're never going to die because we're going to embody ourselves in computers. It's the wrong message, because we shouldn't be teaching about death, and that we're not going to die, we're just going to become computers. There should be no attachment to mothers, and he's off on this. We're not going to be human, we're going to be embodied in computer. This is MIT, this is my life. So I think that I became like very, are you kidding me? No mothers, we're going to go into computer, it's like, I became like very team human, kind of surrounded by people who either we were going to graduate and become computers, we're going to become embodied in computers, we're going to become linked to computers. So I think that I became, I remember one of his students told me that Minsky wanted to, I was interviewing a student, and the student said, well, Minsky wants to create a computer that a soul would want to live in. I mean, I was surrounded by a culture where we were either going to marry computers or graduate and evolve into computers. So I think that I very early in my time at MIT started to think about, well, what was essential about being human? And I think that became, as I began to study children in computers, smart machines, children responding to smart machines, the question of what was essential about being human became something that was just like in my face to start thinking about. So it wasn't like I went into it with this as I wasn't particularly trained as a philosopher, I'm totally out of my depth, actually. There wasn't like my philosophical, it wasn't where I came from philosophically, but I very early on in my, and literally on the ground, what I was studying, these children talking about what it was special about being human, It's what I started to think about, surrounded by these people who couldn't tolerate the movie Bambi because it was too sentimental about humanity.
How did you wind up at MIT? Was that a choice about studying this cyber world?
No. I was in Cambridge, and I was writing. No, this was totally an accident. I was in Cambridge, and I wanted to turn my dissertation, and I'd written my French Freud dissertation, and the dissertation was done, but I wanted to turn it into a book, and so I really wasn't ready to take an assistant professorship job. And MIT offered me a kind of year, what was like a research fellowship, and they said, we have this research fellowship in this new program called Science, Technology, and Society. And at the end of the year, if you want to be an assistant professor, there's a job for you in this new program. But for the year, there's no teaching. You just have to turn your dissertation into a book. And I thought, well, that's a great deal, because I just by accident, but I hadn't, computers were 100% not on my mind. I just wanted to turn my dissertation on Jacques Lacan into a book. But when I was there, I discovered the world of computer. I mean, it was all around me. And I saw I don't want to say the similarities, because that's not strong enough. The analogy between artificial intelligence, psychoanalysis, the science of mind that was now coming into the popular culture, carried by an object. The difference between psychoanalysis and artificial intelligence was very dramatic, because psychoanalysis is carried into the popular culture by writings or dreams. I mean, I argued that there are objects that carry psychoanalysis into popular culture. The fact that we talk about our dreams using a psychoanalytic language is a way that is carried into popular culture. But the computer stuff was being carried into popular culture by this new object, the computer language being carried into popular culture by this new object. And I came to MIT just at the moment when personal computers were starting to be in popular culture. Literally 1976 was the year of the first personal computers. And I just lucked out. I shouldn't say lucked out, because I had to see it. Mm-hmm. I had to, I saw it. I saw it. And I just saw it.
Explain this a little more about in other words, computers were an object to study.
Yes, I call it an evocative object.
Okay, and why are they important? Because they
carried these new ideas. In other words, at MIT at the time, there was artificial intelligence, this new science that's thinking about the mind as a machine. Mm-hmm. There was this new kind of thinking called cognitive science, which was, again, thinking about the mind as a machine, that the human memory could be analogized to the memory in a computer. So the birth of cognitive science, the birth of artificial intelligence, these new sciences of mind that were thinking about the mind in machine terms. And these new ways of thinking about the mind, which now we think of as so natural, we think of the mind as a machine, were now going to be coming into the culture, I thought, because at the same time as they were being discussed in seminar rooms and laboratories, Texas Instruments or Radio Shack or Apple, not yet Apple, but the people in garages that I was learning about, were building personal computers that were going to be starting to come into the culture as objects. And in 1976, I could start to see that. You could start to see that all of this was starting. 76, 77, 78, all of that was starting to happen.
And in the beginning and in your first book on this,
yes,
you were more positive
yes.
about the impact
Very.
of these objects
Yes.
coming into the culture.
Very.
Talk a little about that. I mean, what was great about it then?
Well, because you had a new science of mind, a new way of reflecting on the self that was, I called it children who were meeting computer toys for the first time, met them and began talking like I called them child philosophers. They started talking, these new objects provoked thinking about the self. You know, children would meet these new objects and they would start to talk about, well, these objects are programmed. I wonder if I'm programmed. And they would start to reflect on, well, this is a programmed thing. I wonder if I'm programmed. And they would start to talk about the nature of being programmed. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, they're just like anybody would if they said, well, this thing is programmed. I wonder if I'm programmed. Or they would start to really talk about, and also you have to remember that in the early days, children programmed computers. You couldn't work these computers unless you programmed them. So all children were programmers. So my first book on these objects, there are chapters and chapters on child programmers. Because when children met these computers, you couldn't work with the computers unless you programmed the computers. So there were no computers came with stuff to do with them unless you programmed them. So everybody who had a computer programmed a computer. So the things you did with computers involved your learning to think like a computer, and you're getting involved in computational thinking. And so it was like watching people learn a new way of thinking about, well, maybe the mind works like that. I wonder what it is to think like a computer. I wonder if I think like a computer. I wonder if people have always thought like computers, or what is it to think like a computer? So I was very positive about the kinds of conversations about mind that were happening in the culture, just as I had been very excited about, I wasn't particularly for or against them, that's not my place, but just as I'd been very excited about the kinds of conversations about mind that were happening in France, when people were dialoguing about psychoanalysis. That's an exciting thing to watch.
So at this stage, computers were a tool that, in service of the human mind, in the human.
It provoked thinking.
Yeah.
And then what happened was they became black boxed, and they became they became like games. I mean, they became closed down, and they became something that you sort of no longer were open for that kind of thinking. They became just sort of shut down and not transparent anymore, but opaque, and no longer were kind of available to most people for that kind of reflection. So the nature of what computer culture meant changed.
And so you fortunately wound up in a place where what you were surrounded by and what you came to study was changing over time.
Yes, and what I did was I studied that shift. I studied that shift from transparency to opacity in the nature of these objects, and actually that was the topic of kind of my next books were really marking that shift from transparency to opacity in the nature of the computer culture. And that was, I think, my contribution has been to talk about that shift and really to document the inner life of, how the computer culture has changed our inner life, because now when we're deeply enmeshed in a computer culture that no longer is that kind of evocative object for those sorts of issues. Now we use the computer for very different things, and the issues that it brings up are very different for us. Now I'm onto a whole different set of issues when I talk about the computer culture.
And so the next stage is really confronting what shall we call it, the Bambi moment, essentially, which is to say, why not Bambi? So what's intriguing about what you're saying is it wasn't the extraordinary education so much as the reality that you were confronting that made you more and more sensitive to our loss of humanity.
Well,
or the diminishing.
I think that, in that studying the computer culture at MIT, I studied the changes in what computers have confronted us with changing opportunities and changing challenges. So right now, the challenges that they confront us with are considerable. Right now, the challenges are to our privacy, to our democracy, to our sense of self. Are we happy with the notion of evolving with computers to a different place? People talk about a kind of coevolution with computers. Is that something we're comfortable with? The challenges the challenges Facebook poses to democracy and privacy. That's a different kind of challenge. There are so many things that we're confronted with now. But there's also given my background, I'm particularly interested in what I call artificial intimacy. We have computers that can pretend to be psychotherapists, that can have a conversation with you about your love life, your feelings, your spouse, your children. The fact that a computer can pretend or be good enough to fake intimacy doesn't mean that it's capable of intimacy or empathy. And I think that's this as if intimacy and empathy, people need to sort out whether that's good enough to be the real thing. So I'm trying to spark a conversation about that.
What are two of the core ideas that you latch on to develop? One is solitude.
Yes.
Talk a little about that, because you see solitude as key to the development and maturation of the individuals so that they can go out and confront the world.
Yes. So in Reclaiming Conversation, I talk about two things. I try to organize my ideas, saying, that there are two things that are lost in our recent fascination with our phones, our heads in our phones. And one is that people are becoming less capable of being bored. We're losing the capacity for boredom, and the capacity to be bored is an incredibly important developmental moment. It's so important, because boredom, when you're feeling bored, your brain is not bored at all. Your brain is laying down what's called the default mode network, which is the pathways for the development of a stable sense of an autobiographical self. So you need those moments when you feel bored for your brain really to develop your stable sense of self. And right now, when people feel bored, they have no tolerance, and they go immediately to their phones. So the first thing is I try to argue, remind people of the importance of those moments of boredom, and say, walk towards boredom. Make sure your child doesn't have a phone in front of them, because there are potty trainers with slots for an iPhone and slots for an iPad. No, baby bouncers where you can put an iPad and iPhone. No, mm-hmm. Let your child be bored. Let them develop that capacity. So boredom is very important, and with boredom comes the capacity for solitude. Now, why is solitude? These go together very often, because very often in solitude we need to have that moment of boredom. Now, why is solitude so important? Because the capacity for solitude means you're alone with yourself. You can tolerate your own company. You know your own company, which means that when you go to somebody else, because you're okay with yourself, you can then recognize them for who they are. You're not trying to use who they are to buttress your fragile sense of yourself. You're okay with yourself, so you can recognize another person. So it's actually very important to know who you are and be okay with who you are in order to recognize someone else for who they are. The two really go together. And we forget that. We forget the importance of solitude for relational purposes. And we have to remember the importance of solitude for relational purposes. So the psychoanalytic tradition is so important here because the great psychoanalyst David Winnicott, and here I paraphrase, said, if you don't teach your children to be lonely, if you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely, which is, I think, one of the great insights from the psychoanalytic tradition, which people throw out much too quickly now. You need to know how to be alone in order to be not lonely. Because if you know how to be alone, you'll be able to really connect with other people. And now that we have our phones, people do not know how to be lonely. They go immediately to their phone. And the minute they start to be lonely, I don't want to do this, they go to their phone instead. So they're not really learning about themselves the way they need to learn about themselves.
And then the solitude makes possible the capacity to do conversation.
Yes.
Which is then very important to the further maturation of the self.
Right. So I'm trying to argue now, the challenges we face now are challenges to privacy, are challenges to intimacy, are challenges to democracy, are challenges to identity, but are deeply challenges to, can you put away your phone long enough to know solitude so then you can have relationships? So it's not just that we face, are we going to be human and not fall in love with artificial intelligences? Are we going to be just able to be by ourselves so that we can be with other people? So right now, it's not that I don't like technology, it's that I'm really worried. It's not like an anti-technology position. I'm worried about people. I'm pro-human. I'm not against technology. I'm just very much pro-human. I don't begin with an animosity towards technology. I'm just very concerned about human beings and their development and being able to maintain relationships with other human beings. I don't begin with I'm against technology. Technology is not kind of what's on my, I don't begin with that.
So what over time, as you've studied this subject, your concern emerges as a result of what was a tool has turned us into a tool?
Yeah. What was a tool? Now I don't know what we're using the tool for. I think we've lost our way. When people have a moment of boredom and pick up their phone, it's no longer a tool. It's no longer I'm using it to. It's like I'm using it to not have a moment of boredom. Well, now it's no longer that's not exactly a tool exactly. That's like what is that?
Well, it's a master. It's becoming.
I don't know. It's a tool to not have a moment of boredom. But if a moment of boredom is a good thing because it's helping you develop a self and an identity and a stable self and a set of interests and a capacity for empathy, then it's an underminer of human potential. So that's not a tool anymore. That's an underminer. So that's not a good thing.
And the key here is attention. That you confronting the initial anxiety of boredom and being lonely, your attention is shifted to another place.
Yes.
And data can stream in,
Yeah.
or messages and so on can stream in and distract you.
Yes, that's why I try to say. I gave these Hitchcock lectures, and I tried to say, well, what causes people to get themselves into trouble? And I tried to have like something people could like hold on to, and I say it's vulnerability. I try to boil it down. What is it? And it's our human we're vulnerable. So think about your vulnerability. What are your vulnerabilities? And people are vulnerable. People are vulnerable. They don't want to feel vulnerable. I try to like boil it down to something that people will be able to sort of understand and not feel ashamed of. And I don't think people are necessarily ashamed of feeling vulnerable. I think people need to hold on to something that they don't feel, that they can begin to act on, they don't feel ashamed of. They can say, yeah, that's right, I feel vulnerable. I don't want to feel vulnerable. I'm getting into trouble because I don't want to feel vulnerable. So I don't want people to feel ashamed that they're turning to their phone. And I think that people can latch on to this, that they don't want to feel vulnerable. They feel that moment of feeling, yeah, I feel anxious, I feel alone, I feel vulnerable right now. Like I flew into Berkeley, I'm allergic to something in your air. I'm like, ever since I got here, I'm like sniffling. I felt vulnerable. I reached for my phone. Mm-hmm. I did. I was like alone in my room. I'm like crying. I'm like sniffling. I'm weeping. I reached for my phone because all my friends are on my phone. My family is on. Everybody is nice to me is on my phone. Okay, that's exactly what we do now. When we're weeping and we're sneezing, we reach for our phone. It's like that is what we do. And that's fine, except if we do it all the time. And if a person is available, we don't turn to the person. If we do, and more, instead of turning to the people, we turn to our phones. My students don't want to come and talk to me. They'd rather like send me a message on their phone. My phone. Everybody wants to be not vulnerable because if they see me in person, I could ask them a question that would make them feel vulnerable.
You're concerned now about the societal and political consequences.
Very.
You touched on that a minute ago. I mean, we know that with regard to social media, that all this data is being collected. And I get the sense from reading you that what is being created is a definition of you based on all of the data that is in some ways in conflict with who you are or may want to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we saw in our last election that there's a version of you that's been scraped and available, and that or Brexit, that this data gets sold to actors that have plans and desires and agendas that are very specific and very powerful and really can shape our futures and the future of the planet. So and we're vulnerable because now you can have, there are incredible things that artificial intelligence and altered reality can do. You can have any political figure look as though they're saying anything. You can have Barack Obama look as though he's making a speech that's anti-Semitic. I mean, just his face and his mouth, and you can have anybody saying anything.
So
that you can target. You can target. I mean, forget the expression fake news. You can have any figure, any music figure from music or art or literature saying anything, in a completely convincing way and target that message to people who you know from what they shop and where they go and what they do and who they associate with, and have people who you know they can be influenced by saying anything to them. This is scary, and we just need very, very scary, and people will do this now, and we just need to be on a different kind of alert in this new world.
So you feel vulnerable, your attention is captured by what you see online, and that in turn fortifies what could be very negative aspects of your own persona.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things is that we've signed on to a system where we're used to getting things for free. In other words, you get Google Mail for free, you get Maps for free, you get Docs for free, you get Facebook for free. Now, why are you getting all this for free? You're getting it for free because they're taking everything. They're reading your mail, they're reading your Docs, they're reading what you post. That's why it's free. It's not free. You've agreed that they can read all your mail. They can read all your Docs. And they can know where you go. That's not free. So why was it so important to the founders of this country that the mail, the U.S. mail, be protected? That was like very important. And I remember my grandmother, I write about this in Alone Together. It was very interesting. I mean, there she is, a Jewish woman who from a pogrom background, and she takes me down to the mailboxes in Brooklyn, and she teaches me that the reason we're in this country is that nobody can tamper with our mail, because she knows what it means to have people tamper with your mail. And she says, we're in this country. Now, she knows about J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, I don't want to say that it was a perfect system. I mean, but basically, that's what she teaches her granddaughter. That's what she chooses to teach me, that we're in this country because these mailboxes, that's what America is. It's in the mailboxes. So that was my citizenship lesson. Now, what can I teach my daughter? I'd say in my book, what can I teach my daughter about email when I know that anybody can read her email? Anybody can read her Facebook. Anybody can look at what she's doing online. It's all owned by the people who provide it.
One final question. So it's fair to say that a step in resisting, I guess is the word, is consciousness of the implications of all that's happening to us.
And I think that this is the biggest step, because people, it's like global warming. This is like massive forgetting. This is the thing that people most want to forget. You can watch them forgetting. As soon as you talk to them about it, you can watch them. You can, I'm a crack interviewer, so I can watch them forgetting as I'm interviewing them about it, because nobody wants to be reminded. I said, let's talk about your Gmail. You know that it's. So yeah, I'm about being a pain right now for everybody and reminding everybody.
Well, on that note, and in a positive sense, Sherry, I want to thank you very much for being on our
program. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation in history.